So welcome back. This is video 3 of 3 in Gregory's 3-part series on how to start plants from seeds. In this video we're going to be talking about transplanting outdoors, making sure you get really good results and some cool tips and tricks on doing that. In our previous videos we talked about getting started, the how-tos and the whys, and how to take your seeds from germination to the point that we're going to be talking about now, which is transplanting. So Liza, what is transplanting? What does that mean?
Well, transplanting is when you take the seeds that you've raised and you put them in their place in the garden. So usually you've kind of got an idea, the tall stuff's going to be in the back, the short stuff in the front. You want to know what needs full sun, what needs part sun, what needs shade. And then you want to put it in the ground correctly. So you're usually going to do it about 6 to 8 weeks after you've started them in the trays, and if you're discovering that the weather's really bad unexpectedly, or you started them a little too early, you can get some larger pots and just pop them up into that. And that's the same thing as transplanting, because you're giving the roots a little bit more room, and then you have a little bit more leeway before you put them outside.
Yeah, the 6 to 8 week rule is generally just to basically make sure your plants aren't getting root bound, because that could kind of permanently stunt them if the roots are all wrapped up in this little space. So like she's saying, just if you can't get them outside at that point, go ahead and put them into a bigger pot or a bigger cell, whatever it happens to be. Keep them going.
So once you're ready to do that, I found that this is actually challenging for a lot of people, and it makes sense if you've never done it before. With these kind of seed packs, they've got like a little bit of a soft bottom right here. So if you first gently, you don't want to like crush your plant, just kind of gently squeeze it on both sides like that, so that you've made a little bit of air there, and then you do like this. Kind of think of it like getting ice out of an ice cube tray. You want to loosen it enough that it'll pop out, and then you want to just gently hold the whole root ball and put that in the ground, because usually your plant stem is not strong enough to hold the weight of a wet soil block on the end of it, and if you just pick it up by the plant, you're going to rip it without its roots.
And with the plastic cells too, it might be kind of hard to see, but typically your roots when they're ready to transplant, the roots are going to be grown through these little holes. Yeah. So what she's saying is basically to get them out without doing too much damage to the roots. You certainly don't want to go and just pull the thing out like that, otherwise you're going to end up destroying the roots or snapping the stem. So just basically making sure you're being as gentle as possible to those root systems.
And now if you break off a little bit of those roots, that'll still be okay. But ideally you'll get them out in the garden before the roots are so long on the bottom that you have to tear off a bunch of them. And then very important with the peat pots, when you put these in, you don't want to leave like this much of the pot above the soil line. In general, anytime you plant a seedling, this is going to be full of soil, and you're going to want to put it about, maybe only like 1/4 of an inch or 1/2 centimeter below the soil, so that the soil that's on top is the same as what's in your garden, and that keeps it from uneven drying problems. But you don't want to bury it really deep, and you don't want to leave it above the ground. So if you have that above the ground, this acts as a wick, and the sun hits it, and it dries up this pot, and so then the roots of your plants have a hard time getting out and into your garden.
Good tips. As I mentioned in some of our previous videos, the sunlight that you get indoors, even through your grow lights, is going to be less intense than what you get out in full sunlight outdoors. So you're going to want to make sure that you don't put your seedlings out that have never really experienced that natural, full, intense sunlight, and they get burned, which actually happens quite a bit. You can get through all this and you can lose your seedlings by putting them out and exposing them to direct sunlight too quickly. So if your seedlings haven't been sort of transitioned over this period of time between germination and transplant, you're going to want to harden them off, which basically just means get them ready to go outdoors, get them acclimated to the full, intense sunlight. So the schedule that we like to recommend for doing that is days 1 through 3. You're going to want to place your seedlings outdoors in a shady spot. They'll only get about 3 to 5 hours of direct sunlight throughout the day. Or if it's an overcast day, if you look at the weather forecast and it says cloudy all day, but the temperatures are right, you can put them out basically right out in the open. If it's days 4 through 5, you're going to want to put your seedlings in a slightly sunnier spot. They'll get about 5 or 6 hours of direct sunlight per day. And then on days 6 through 7, it's time to start transitioning them into the full sun spot. And our studio audience always goes crazy when we start talking about full sun and light sun. So if you're periodically taking your indoor seedlings outside, prior to this period, where they've already been experiencing sunlight, then you don't necessarily have to worry about this. This is basically if you're going directly from grow lights or from a fully indoor situation to where they're outside. Keep in mind throughout this process as you're going, that you're going to want to keep an eye on your seedling leaves, and if you see any kind of browning or sort of papery look to them, that means you're getting too much sun exposure. You're going to want to draw them back a little bit and kind of reset that schedule, take them out of the sunlight. That means you're getting sunburn, so that could be a problem. So again, as I mentioned earlier, if you're periodically bringing your seedlings outdoors throughout the process, you might not have to harden them off, but this is more of a situation that you're going to want to go through if you've kept your seedlings under grow lights the entire time, or if they've been inside the entire time and haven't been exposed to direct sunlight previously.
So once you get ready to put them outside, it's important to pay attention to the weather. You may want to get a weather app for your phone and check that frequently. And definitely, if there's any kind of storms coming up or anything that looks, very out of the ordinary, freezes, that kind of thing, you want to wait before you put them out. Yeah, actually, our first year, we had a bunch of seed cells out, and our trays were outside, and it said, severe thunderstorms that day, and we left. We came back, there had been a hailstorm, and about half of our seedlings were under a pile of ice and broken, so it was kind of heartbreaking. It was a good learning experience though, because we basically said, okay, now in the future, we're going to look at the weather forecast before we put our seedlings outdoors. Yeah, and then the other thing that you want to do is make sure you put them in the right place. So you don't want to put something that requires shade in the sun or vice versa. That's also dependent on what region you're in. If you're in a southern area, you can often put things like lettuce into the shade, whereas if you're in the north, you're going to want to put those in full sun. But for the most part, you want to follow the directions on your seed pack, and you also want to place it so that your tall items are in the west corner of your bed, and your shorter items are in front of that, because then the taller ones don't shade the shorter ones. A lot of people will try to grow like a big beefsteak tomato in a shady spot, and they just need a ton of sun to make those huge fruits with all the sugars, so they're not going to do anything if you do that.
So to your point, after transplanting, you want to make sure that you have when you're figuring out where you want to transplant your seedlings, think about what it is you're planting. Is it full sun? Is it part sun? Is it full shade? We have that information in our seed packets, also on our quick guides and grow guides if you don't know it. So you might be able to get away with a small tomato variety, a cherry tomato, in sort of a part shade spot, but for a beefsteak, you're definitely going to want to go with a full sun spot. So just knowing those sort of things and figuring out where your plant placement, where you're putting them, is going to be important for optimal growing results. Yeah, the further south you are, the more you can cheat, but the more northern your climate is, you're definitely going to want to go with exactly what the packet says. Rather than planting all your plants in straight rows of the same exact species or same variety or whatever happens to be, that's called monoculture. What we really encourage you to do as an organic gardener or someone who studies nature, think about biodiversity. So plants are like people. They grow better in diverse communities, other species around them. So there's actually a symbiosis that forms as a result of biodiversity. So in gardening lingo, that's called companion planting, or in permaculture, we call that guilds, using plant guilds, which is a little different, but essentially it's the same thing in that you're using different combinations of plants that work well, that play well, that live well together, and they actually enhance and benefit each other through all these different processes, which are really fascinating. So think about your companion plants or your plant guilds. And when you're putting your plants out, make sure to use those. And if you don't know what those are, you can either use Google, or if you're a Grow Journey member, check out your grow guides and then go down to the plant guild section. And we've already done all that work for you. We know what works, what doesn't work, and we've looked at the research. So you can use that tool when you're planting your garden to get better results. You have some that you really like that you can sort of common. Yeah, I mean, some plants, they actually form symbiotic relationships with bacteria and make their own fertilizer, and then they share that fertilizer with the plants near them. But one of the ones I really like is any kind of flower that attracts predators that will eat the pest in my garden. So for example, I really like to plant dill, which I love to put in my pickles and stuff, but I also like it for the flowers because they're just a beacon for the kind of wasps that will eat the caterpillars, like tomato hornworm and other pest caterpillars in my garden. Mm-hmm. Yeah, parasitic wasps. Yeah. And so if you put that near the plant that you know is going to have those kinds of problems, then that's a good guild member to get that taken care of before you ever even have to deal with it. Yeah. So plant communities, just think about that as you're planning out where to put your final plants out in the garden. On the inverse of that, though, there's allelopathic plants, which are basically plants that don't grow well with other plants. So just keep that in mind too. Again, we provide that information to members in our grow guides. If you don't know what those are, look it up. So if you're going to put a tomato out in your garden, for instance, just look up tomato plants allelopathic. And if you don't know how to spell that, it's ALLE. I don't know how to spell it.
LOPATHIC.
Yeah. So look that up, and you can figure it out yourself also.
The main one that people know is black walnut. There's some others, but they release stuff into the soil that prevents other plants from germinating.
Yeah, and actually I think partially seeds have it on them too. But there's a substance in walnuts, black walnuts, called juglin, which is basically just keeps plant other seedlings from germinating and actually inhibits their growth. So anyway, there's other things out there like that. So just keep that in mind. Be wary of it as you're putting things out in your garden.
So once you start transplanting your seedlings outdoors, we recommend that you have these items on hand: gardening gloves, a spade, a bucket of worm castings or fresh sweet-smelling compost. Don't use it if it smells bad. Your seed markers in case you want to put them in the ground next to your seedlings to remember what variety you're growing where. And that's really it.
If we get this quiet down just a little bit so that the audience online can hear. Ladies, there in front, please.
Did everyone turn off their cell phones?
So here's 7 tips and tricks that will really help you get a leg up on your transplanting. That's when you're putting your plants outdoors. So the first one seems sort of common sense maybe, but look at your 10-day weather forecast before you put your plants outdoors. We've actually made this mistake, and so we're telling you this from having painful experiences ourselves. So even if it's you're past your last frost date in the spring and it's nice and warm out, with global weirding as we call it, which is basically just hard, really weird weather, infrequent temperature fluctuations all the time. You might be warm one day, you might be 75 degrees and sunny, and you put your plants out, and if you look at your 10-day forecast, you could have seen that 5 days out there's this weird freeze coming. So now you're out in the process of trying to cover up your plants, or panicked and trying to figure out what to do about it. Whereas if you just looked out a little bit from that forecast, you might have been able to just keep your plants indoors a little bit longer. So you have a tomato trick too. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, so with tomatoes, they'll actually put roots out along their stems, and if you want to impress people with your geeky knowledge, you can say that they're called adventitious roots. But if you're going to go to plant tomato plants, you can actually ignore what I said earlier about not planting them too deep. And in the case of a tomato seedling, if you had one coming up out of here, you could actually plant most of the stem underground. And I like to do it sideways like this. So I'll dig my hole this way and put it just a little bit below the earth and have the stem like this. And so then it will start to put out those adventitious roots all along the sides of the stem there. And you get a much larger root system, which makes your plant stronger and it grows faster. So just leave just a little bit of the leaves above the surface, and it's okay if they're laying on the ground, because you'll notice within a day they'll start to change and lift up toward the light. So even though the stem's like this part will stand upright and look like it's not falling over.
Yeah. And tomatoes are sort of crazy plants. They're very unique with the adventitious roots. There's not many plants like that. So if you did that to most of your transplants, you actually end up killing them. So just make sure that's really clear.
Just tomatoes, or if you've looked it up and you know for sure, because there are a few others, but not many. Mm-hmm.
So if you want to really dig in and kind of geek out on your tomato transplanting knowledge, we have a blog on our article. It's all about 5 tips for growing really great tomatoes, and that's one of them. So you can dig into more tricks and tips specifically on tomatoes, because people love tomatoes. Another trick that we were learning to use is called the stick trick, and that's when we're transplanting things that have a stem on them. You can't necessarily do it on a big leafy thing like a lettuce. But with the stick trick, what you're doing is you're stopping cutworms. And if you've ever had this experience where you go out one day, you have this nice healthy seedling, and the next day you go out and your seedling's been looks mowed down by some kind of small creature, just
like tiny lumberjack.
Yeah, it's terrible. So that's called a cutworm, and it's a worm that's either right below the soil surface, sometimes they're on top of the soil surface, just depends. But they go along and then they feel the seedling, this nice tender morsel, and they just chop it down. That seems to be all they really eat. So it's just terrible.
If they get too high above the soil level, they're exposed to predators, so they only eat that little tiny part.
Yeah, absolutely. So one way you can deal with that sounds simple, but you're just tricking this little creature into thinking that plant is a lot harder and denser than it actually is. So you take a stick, toothpick will work, or you can use a stick out of your yard like we use from our oaks. It's about roughly that same size, and just insert it in the ground right next to your stem, deep enough so that when the worm comes under the soil surface, it hits that stick. Because what they do is they kind of wrap around it, and so they'll start feeling it. And when they feel that stick, they think this thing is basically a lot tougher or a lot denser than it actually is. So then they'll go moving on, looking for the next victim, and they'll leave your plant alone. So it's a very simple way, completely, obviously, organic. Pesticides, no chemicals required, just tricking the worm into thinking that the plant is actually stronger than it is or bigger than it is.
And then another trick you can use for the same pest is with toilet paper tubes. You've got one. Yeah. So, you can cut them to about this size. And then when you're going to push them in the ground, I'll just use this as an example. So if you've got soil like this, you're going to push them into the ground so that they're, about, you can see the soil on there, about that deep. But you want to make sure, like if your seedling is larger than this toilet paper tube and you push it down like that, you might be slicing through the roots of your seedling. So just be careful of that when you do it. But what that does is it makes it so when the caterpillar, the cutworm, they're called worms, but they're caterpillars, come along, they run into the side of this and then they stop and they move on somewhere else.
Adding good microbes to your soil during transplant. So what we mean by that is if you haven't already kind of treated your soil with either good aerated hot composted compost or actively aerated compost tea, there's a pretty good chance that you don't necessarily have a great degree of good healthy biology in your soil. So adding microbes simply means either taking some good sweet smelling compost or some worm castings, and whenever you dig your hole to put your seedling in the ground, go ahead and put some of that in there. And what you're essentially doing is giving those root systems inoculating with a nice big boost of good beneficial microorganisms that are going to help that plant thrive throughout its life. And yes, our audience members here in the live audience, they are very, very good at making some compost. So thank you for that, for your contributions. So that sort of ties into our next tip, which is basically all about no-till organic gardening. And so this is a big transition that people are making or have been making over the past little bit. You're starting to see it become much more mainstream. Again, a ton of research behind it. But no-till basically means you're not plowing, you're not tilling. And that takes a massive amount of work out of your job as a gardener or a farmer. And it also basically does dramatic things to the health of your soil. So when you till your garden or you till your soil, what you're essentially doing is it's comparable to an earthquake or hurricane or something like that hitting a city and just knocking all these things out of whack. All these ecosystems that are in your soil, again from mycorrhizal fungi to all the different kind of nematodes and predatory insects. You're basically throwing all those things into disarray, and you're exposing your soil to sunlight, UV radiation, all these things. So by not tilling, what you're doing is you're allowing your soil ecosystems to remain intact, and then you're feeding them from the surface with things like brown mulches, which are wood chips and leaves, or green mulches, which are cover crops that you then drop down and you plant your seedlings in those. So by doing that, what you're doing is tapping into the same systems out there in nature that work, that allow a tree in a forest never to have to get fertilized or watered or sprayed with poisons in order to grow well. Because basically what's taking place there is all the ecosystem, all these things that are feeding these kind of constantly recycling and reusing.
And they're tilling for you, which I thought was crazy the first time I heard it, because we have heavy clay soil here, and I tilled every year. And I kind of did it by accident by leaving a deep pile of mulch on a hard-packed part of clay in my driveway, and the following year it was beautiful, loamy soil, and I'd never tilled it. And that was when I finally stopped thinking that people were insane when they talked about this.
Yeah, and this scales actually, this isn't just the thing you can do in your garden, but it scales all the way up to large-scale farming. So if you look at some of the research coming out of, for instance, Rodale Institute, where they're doing side-by-side 30-year trial studies versus conventional till farming, huge differences in both yield and productivity and soil health. So you're storing way more carbon in your soil, you're recycling that nitrogen, your water is able to penetrate easier and it's able to be retained easier. So if you think about all the things you don't like doing when you think about gardening, weeding, adding fertilizer, plowing, all the work, all the stuff that people think about, gosh, that sucks, I don't want to do it.
Nobody's doing that for the forest.
Yeah.
There it is.
We don't do it in our garden. So that's a nice thing. Basically, at that point, really the hardest part of some of the stuff is once you get your plants in that soil, is just keeping up with the harvest, because you have so much food that you're like, man, what am I going to do with this? Now I got to go bring it over to the neighbor's house and drop off a big pail of food for them. So it's kind of
lock
cool.
their door and hide from you.
But the important thing is, by understanding soil ecology, by understanding soil health, you can eliminate so much of the work and so much of the aggravation. And you get to, the downside is you have healthy plants and tons of food.
Put your transplant in and just let it grow. Yeah,
it's pretty cool stuff. So no-till organic gardening, big thing that we highly advocate. In a garden system or small growing space, wood chips are fantastic for this. You can get them typically free. depending on where you live. You can get the chip companies or tree care companies to drop them at your house. Leaves work great in the fall. You can use those. And we typically put about 6 to 8 inches on our garden, as does Eliza, twice a year. So we put ours on in the early spring and again late summer right before fall. And our microbes are eating that stuff all year long. And it also feeds our soil, the other microorganisms like the beneficial mycorrhizal fungi. So you're essentially feeding your soil what it knows how to eat, which is plant material and plant debris. And your soil then feeds your plants. So it's this beautiful give and take relationship. When you're transplanting your seedlings into a no-till garden, for instance, in our garden we use maybe probably 6 to 8 inches of mulch a couple times a year.
I'll just hold my hands like this, and people go, really, and it's like, definitely.
So we get free wood chips. We get them dropped here, or basically these things are everywhere. So
sometimes you have to pay a nominal fee. Yeah. Sometimes your city will have them available.
Mm-hmm. But putting those wood chips on the soil surface is letting them. You're not tilling it in. You're just leaving them to sit there. And basically, you're again covering the soil. You're feeding those microbes, protecting the soil from the sun. So how do you plant in that situation? How do you put your seedlings in? So that's the question, right? So it's not very hard to do. You basically just pull back in mulch where you want to put your transplant, and you put it in, and then you don't want to put the mulch all the way really deep against the stem of the plant. So maybe no more than maybe a half inch right around the plant.
So it might be this deep over here, mm-hmm. and then where he's put in the transplant, it would be really shallow. Yeah, so it sort of kind of slopes down to it. If you put it all the way against your stems of your plants, you risk rotting the plant and whatnot. So as far as if you want to direct sow into a no-till garden of this nature where you have all the mulch, again, pull back your mulch, put in your seeds right there, let them come up, everything's fine. So you can use a lighter mulch on that too, like a straw.
Yeah.
If you want to.
Yeah, that works great.
But
too.
Mostly you would leave the soil bare when you're direct sowing until your plants start to come up, and then you can tuck the mulch back in.
Mm-hmm. And on that note, we one of the other things to mention here is it's called thinning out, which is you can do it when you're starting indoors. You can do it when you're starting outdoors too. Typically, with things like kales and lettuces and things like that, we like to direct sow those and kind of scatter them out into a bed. So here we go. This is way more dense than you'd want a mature plant. So what you're going to do, these are the leggy seedlings we showed you earlier. So if you put in, let's say, 50 seeds into a single 6 by 6 inch spot, you would thin out your smaller plants as they start to come up. You want to leave your healthiest, hardiest, most robust plants. Let those be the ones that come to maturity.
Mm-hmm. And there's no reason to do this at home. Like, it's much easier to just put like 1 to 4 seeds per cell, and the only reason to do this is if you just want to germinate them in there, and then you take them all out and you put them into individual pots afterward. And some people do that for space saving with a heat mat, but there's no reason to do this otherwise.
Yeah.
Once you've transplanted your seedlings, you want to make sure to water deeply around the base of the plant, and that's about the equivalent of 1 inch of rainfall. But you just want to make sure you really soak that soil in, because instead of tamping the soil down really hard around the plant, you want to use the water to get the soil particles to cling to the roots and keep it from drying out. And one thing to keep in mind is when you see things that say you need to get your plants established, that's a minimum of 6 weeks of making sure they don't dry out. So once again, the wrung out sponge thing, if the soil feels like a wrung out sponge, it's good. If it starts to dry more than that, you're going to want to water. It's definitely not, I'm going to water every day, because you can overdo it. If possible, it's better to use drip irrigation when you're watering than it is to use an overhead watering system, especially as the plants get older, because there's a lot of foliar diseases that happen when the water hits the ground and splashes it up onto the leaves. But there again, the mulch will help you out.
I was about to say, the mulch is another great benefit of mulch. There's research studies talking about the bullet point list of all the benefits to mulch, and it's about that long. That's another one that she hit on. So if you have bare exposed soil, and that water, that rain, or whether it's your irrigation or whether it's a hard rain, hits that soil surface and splatters the stuff all over your leaves, it's going to lead to a lot more foliar diseases, a lot more, also thinking about like you're eating your lettuce and it's all covered with dirt.
Yeah, and you have mulch, you don't have to wash it as much.
Yeah, so it's another benefit there. Okay, so now your plants are they're outdoors, they're in your garden, they've been transplanted. You've gone through this whole process, which is great. So there's a little quick thing just called transplant shock that you should be aware of. So you put your plants in the ground, you come out the next couple of days, they haven't really grown that much. So you start getting a little anxious, have I done something wrong? Don't worry about that. This is called transplant shock. Basically, your plants are putting the energy into getting those roots established in that new soil. And so once they do that, once they start kind of getting going, Usually it takes maybe about a week, and then you'll start to see that above ground growth starting to take place, and that's when you know your roots have tapped into that new space, and they're strong, they're getting going. So don't be nervous if your plants aren't, don't take off the day after you put them in the ground. That's perfectly normal.
But one thing to keep in mind is when you see, almost everything will say water until established. That's a minimum of 6 weeks, and for perennials, it's a whole year. Mm-hmm. So just keep that in mind as well, is that you don't want to let it dry out the first year, especially for perennials, because they're still getting established enough that they can survive during a drought.
And perennials is really quick just to introduce in terms of annual plants or things like the tomatoes, basically the single season plants that we talked about. Perennials are things like your fruit trees, your nut trees, your blueberries, all those sort of things, but things that are basically going to outlive you. Mm-hmm. So they take about a year.
But if you grew, say, a sage plant for the seed, that's a perennial in some areas, that kind of thing.
Yep. Yeah. So we hope you really enjoyed this videos and you learned a lot. A 3-part video series here from Grow Journey. We know our studio audience did. We certainly heard a lot from them today, so thank you for being with us. If you have any questions or any comments, please reach out to us. You can use the YouTube comments section if you like to. Email us directly if you prefer. Either way, we really appreciate your time. Hope you've learned a lot, and we look forward to hearing from you and seeing you next time we do another video. Thanks so much.